Hey, did anyone else see that one of the new submarine voyages in 7.5 is AERSLAENT? And does anyone else remember that the interdimensional key is sat on a map in the 7.0 cinematic and it sat directly on AERSLAENT? I feel like I'm losing my mind. It's probably nothing. Anyway, one of my favorite long-standing traditions of Final Fantasy XIV is seeing how Creative Studio 3 takes bits and pieces from previous Final Fantasies and then how they weave them together to create a new story altogether. I love this so much that I even run my own D&D campaign set in a homebrew setting where a Mikote and a Burmesian might travel to Wutai to fight Shantoto. Shit gets weird. If you're old enough to remember the 90s, think of it like this. You're 8 years old and you have a toy box full of action figures, but they're all from different franchises. Ninja Turtles, G.I. Joe, He-Man. Your young, developing mind wants to create a story, so you adapt and improvise and pull these different heroes from different stories into a single story that becomes uniquely yours. Now, ideally, Creative Studio 3 will come up with something better than 8-year-old me did, but the point is that the act of taking familiar races, individuals, moments, and locations, and repurposing them and recombining them until they're almost unrecognizably unique is consistently a blast. But what might be even more fun than seeing how they weave these stories is trying to predict which stories they're going to pull from next. And for Evercold, I think we already have a pretty good idea which direction they're going. Let me explain. First though, let me explain a little bit more about how Final Fantasy XIV does its references. First and foremost, the DNA of Final Fantasy is everywhere. Even when expansions lean heavily on one specific serial entry, the game is still, at all times, borrowing from every game as it fits and using every tool in their toolbox, a lot like the previous toy box analogy. Now, I personally feel like Final Fantasy XIV has taken 3 different approaches to how it handles its referencing, which I'm going to call thematic referencing, inspired referencing, and direct referencing. For A Realm Reborn and Heavensward, it was thematic referencing. What this means is that the focus was telling an original story while adhering to the themes, motifs, and expectations inherent in a Final Fantasy. Both of these expansions did not lean overly heavy on any particular installment. What this allowed was the freedom for Creative Studio 3 to tell their own story without getting overly referential. From Heavensward, we moved on to Stormblood and Shadowbringers, which is what I consider the era of inspired referencing. These installments chose a specific numbered Final Fantasy and leaned heavily on them. Stormblood has Final Fantasy VI with its research facility and Doma Castle and overall fight against the evil empire. Meanwhile, Shadowbringers might seem a bit more subtle, but I've always felt that Final Fantasy III inspirations have been there with the Crystal Tower, the Warriors of Darkness, and the prominence of the Eternal Winds theme. That's right, before that being Graha's theme, it was the Final Fantasy III theme.
I like that. I'm gonna steal it. That's mine now.
What these expansions set out to do was select a specific legacy game as a foundational pillar for themes and references and build out from there. It took iconic and recognizable places and people and moments and repurposed and reconfigured them into wholly new and unique stories. But it always had the backbone of that pillar story to serve as a narrative lodestone. This is the era I consider the Goldilocks zone of being just right, honoring the past while forging a path forward. Finally, we have the era of Endwalker and Dawntrail, which I consider direct referencing. Now, despite Endwalker being my favorite expansion of all time, I do have to admit that this is, in my opinion, the weakest method of reference that Creative Studio 3 has utilized up to this point. A far less charitable person may even call this method lazy or derivative, but I don't think it's ever been pushed to those extremes. What direct referencing does is take a more hands-on approach to its references, sometimes pulling imagery, characters, and locations from their source material and applying it to the game nearly one for one. What this means is that we have Golbez's exact design from Final Fantasy IV, or Treno laid out almost exactly as we remember it in Final Fantasy IX. While this type of referencing is good for a quick dopamine hit of nostalgia, it unfortunately carries with it the inherent weakness of not really crafting a unique identity beyond, well, member berries.
Hey, member!
Final Fantasy IV.
Member!
Cecil.
This gets even worse in examples like the Final Fantasy XI Alliance raid, which is basically a theme park of locales, or, most egregiously, how references are handled in Living Memory, where locations are simply just name-dropped and never elaborated upon, effectively dooming the likes of Clara and Daguerreo and Conde Petit to never being realized in-game at all, condemned to being nothing more than a singular line of text written for the cheapest possible fan service. I'm going in hard right now, so it's worth noting that even though I feel like this is a weak way to deliver references, Creative Studio 3 by no means lost the ability to deliver references in the more inspired style. Sphene, for example, is a fantastic reimagining of the Garnet archetype, and Solution 9 serves as such a clever parallel for the Aoife tree that I feel many people completely overlook it. Now, you might be saying something like, but Shadowbringers is Final Fantasy VIII because of the Eden series, or, but Stormblood is Final Fantasy Tactics because of the Alliance raids. And I would say that I'm focusing on the backbones of these expansions' main scenario quests, but also, the fact that they're drawing from different games in the side content is kind of my point. Final Fantasy XIV, when at its best, is not going through the motions simply retelling the plot points of the stories it draws from. They pull from everything, everywhere, all at once. There are layers to this, and there is no one singular correct answer or reference. The history of Final Fantasy is so rich and textured that there will constantly be opportunities to find harmony in references, where a single plot point could end up being a callback to 2 or 3 or even more things all at the same time. So it's time for me to say that 1, I believe that Creative Studio 3 is returning to inspired referencing, because the imagery and themes I've picked up on are a spectrum of subtlety that tells me that they're going to be focusing on an original story flavored by reference as opposed to just giving us a reference whole cloth. And 2, I believe Evercold will be primarily referencing not 1, but 2 Final Fantasies in its storytelling. I believe that the time has come for our Final Fantasy VII expansion, and it will also serve as our Final Fantasy XIII expansion. If you're new to the Final Fantasy fandom, there's a couple things you need to know about these two games. First and foremost, it is a long-standing meme that Final Fantasy XIII is just a rough imitation of everything that made Final Fantasy VII great. The memes about Lightning just being Girl Cloud are very well known to anyone who has been in the fandom long enough, and while I think these parallels are unfair and a bit reductive, I can admit that the two games do draw many similar parallels, and I'd even be willing to say that several of them are intentional homages. So pairing these two games together makes natural sense, as any references to one may have significant overlap with the other. The other thing you need to know about the history between these two games is the unfortunate truth that Final Fantasy XIII is perhaps the least popular and most maligned game in the series. I think this critical view of the game is likely overblown, and maybe someday I'll do a video getting into why. But for now, the important thing to note is that the fandom by and large holds an unfavorable view towards the entry. Meanwhile, Final Fantasy VII enjoys a place on the opposite end of the spectrum, as it is not only far and away the most popular and iconic entry in the series, it stands as one of the most important titles in video game history, period. Because Final Fantasy XIV is an ongoing game whose end is nowhere in sight, Creative Studio 3 is going to need to use every part of the Final Fantasy Buffalo. That means that Final Fantasy XIII must be accessed eventually, and its themes, creatures, locations, and character archetypes be utilized for reference. If there are any anxieties that the unfavorable position that Final Fantasy XIII holds in the hearts and minds of Final Fantasy fans may have an effect on sales of an expansion that references it, then it stands to reason that Yoshi-P might hedge his bets by bundling it alongside the series' most popular title. Finally, we have to take one of the few things we know about Evercold into consideration, and that is its emphasis on Nordic imagery and reference to Norse mythology. Norse mythology has had a recurring impact on Final Fantasy from the start, and Odin is part of the pantheon of summoned creatures who show up in pretty much every game. However, there are two titles in the series that particularly lean into this theme, and you're never going to guess which two they are. Final Fantasies XIII and VII have, pound for pound, the most Norse references of all the mainline Final Fantasy games put together. In most cases, this doesn't go much further than location names, but the volume I find notable. For Final Fantasy VII, we begin in the city of Midgar, a diesel-punk capitalist dystopia, and in Norse mythology, the realm of mortals is called Midgard. Not too far from Midgar, there is a swamp inhabited by a serpent that is called either Midgar-Zolom or Midgard-Zormir, depending on what version you're playing. This serpent shares a name with the world serpent of Norse mythology, also called Jormungandr. Finally, there's the village of Nibelheim, which is very likely inspired by the Norse realm of Niflheim, a realm that perhaps may be worth noting is a primordial realm of eternal frost and winter, a place that might be Evercold. Fuck, I'm clever. Final Fantasy XIII's references, meanwhile, are usually more direct. Yggdrasil is a tree of life that is able to prolong the inevitable apocalypse by being fed soul energy. Ragnarok is the name of the terrible beast fated to destroy Cocoon, and Valhalla is the name of the domain of the goddess Etro, a domain that looks like this, compared to an enemy we'll be facing who looks like this. While these specific themes may or may not be visited in Evercold, the important part is Final Fantasy XIII's proximity to Norse mythology in general. One of the cheekier references to these two games being our shared inspiration, in my opinion, is something we've already experienced. 7.5 serves as our prologue into Evercold, and what's the first boss that we fight in this prologue? Why, a scorpion tank, of course. Those of you with Final Fantasy Ball knowledge will know where this is going, but for the rest of you, Final Fantasy VII very famously opens with a bombing run on a fantasy nuclear reactor, and this energy plant is protected by a robotic scorpion, who you should absolutely attack while the tail is up. Likewise, Final Fantasy XIII opens with a very similar bestingered arachnid robot. This is one of Final Fantasy XIII's most direct references to Final Fantasy VII, and I'm pretty confident this is Final Fantasy XIV referencing them both. And yes, this is not the first time we've seen this particular Garlean model of Scorpion Sentinel, but it feels like a very deliberate and intentional moment to bring it back. Now, from this point forward, I do want to issue a general spoiler warning, particularly for Final Fantasy XIII and the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy. I'll try to keep the spoilers from being too damaging, but nonetheless, this is your warning. To begin with the Final Fantasy XIII similarities, we start with the conceit around which the fourth appears to be built, a world too savage and unkind for civilization to thrive, so its people take to the skies and make a home among the heavens. As I mentioned in the previous video, this compares rather nicely with Final Fantasy XIII's Pulse and Cocoon. Cocoon is a massive, floating, artificial world suspended above the planet, built and maintained by godlike machines called fal'Cie to serve as a controlled, sheltered environment for humanity. Its society is orderly but heavily surveilled, and anything associated with Pulse is feared and purged. Pulse, by contrast, is the wild, untamed surface below. It is a vast and dangerous land inhabited by powerful creatures and remnants of ancient civilizations. Now, comparison should be pretty obvious. In both settings we have a populace retreated to the skies, and a planet roamed by giant beasts that cannot support civilized life. However, through this we may also be able to extrapolate some hints as to the nature of societies on the Fourth. Cocoon is a highly controlled and rigid authoritarian environment, and part of the control it exerts over its populace is a system of propaganda that exaggerates the dangers of Pulse. While Pulse is indeed a dangerous and savage land, it is also a land of freedom and beauty where civilization can flourish. It's therefore reasonable to assume that these may be themes we'll similarly explore on the Fourth, and we'll likely discover life persisting on the planet's surface. Now, it does bear mentioning that the floating continents are by no means exclusive to Final Fantasy XIII, with flying landmasses appearing in Final Fantasies III, V, VI, and XII. The second greatest parallel actually comes from outside of Final Fantasy, in that of Chrono Trigger, where a floating continent is suspended over a world locked in eternal winter. However, due to the other parallels with Cocoon and Pulse, I believe Final Fantasy XIII is our nearest comparison. Next, we have next to zero information about this pair of Aura. It is interesting to note that the older man has one eye, which almost certainly ties back to Norse mythology and the one-eyed Odin the Allfather. But beyond that, we have a stoic man in dark clothes and a young woman in prayer. I will admit that this is more of a vibe call than one based on fact, but this imagery is very reminiscent of Caius Ballad and Padra Su Yule from Final Fantasy XIII too. Yule is a seer who is able to peer into the future. However, every time she does so, her lifespan is shortened, and is thus fated to die young. She is then reborn with the same talent, doomed to repeat the cycle. Caius is Padra's immortal guardian, a man who has devoted himself to her protection throughout all of her lifetimes. As such, Caius has had to watch Yule live and die a number of times beyond his count, which drives him to seek a way to break the cycle by killing the goddess Etro and collapsing time itself. Now, to emphasize, we have no information about who these two Aura are. so it would be irresponsible to speculate with confidence that they are meant to be our Caius and Yule stand-ins. However, between the male Alra's stoic and pensive gaze at the young girl, and the girl's almost angelic presence and sudden dispersal, it's not unfair to be looking in that direction. Speculation surrounding that girl doesn't end there, however, as there's another individual from Final Fantasy XIII who is iconic for her prayer, Erba Dia Vanille. You may know Vanille from Final Fantasy XIII as a very upbeat, lighthearted character, but in Lightning Returns, she is no longer that bubbly girl, but instead a quieter, more burdened figure, serving as a spiritual intermediary in a dying world. She serves as a kind of oracle, using her unique sensitivity to souls in the unseen realm to help gather and guide the dead, a role that leaves her emotionally strained and isolated. Vanille carries a deep guilt and fear tied to her past and the consequences of her powers, and her arc centers on confronting that guilt, rather than hiding behind optimism. Vanille is also one half of the equation that becomes the aforementioned creature Ragnarok, so it's possible that if this character is a Vanille stand-in, she may be responsible for Calamity itself. There is one last candidate for who the praying girl might represent, and it's the one most people leapt to, and that would be the iconic and irreplaceable Aerith Gainsborough of Final Fantasy VII. If you're somehow not familiar, Aerith is a flower seller who balances a positive cheerfulness with an almost gremlin-like playfulness. But this innocent exterior hides a much deeper inner story. Aerith is the last of her people, known as the Cetra, an ancient race with very deep ties to the planet, and she's constantly hounded throughout the first act of the game by the Shinra Electric Power Company, who believe she is the key to finding their promised land. Speaking of promised land, those words sure were said in the teaser trailer, weren't they?
Alright, I'm ready. Tell me about the promised land.
This one was one a lot of people immediately latched onto, and like most information right now, we don't really have a lot to go on, but we do know that the young girl who mentions it seems to be speaking in reference to the frozen and abandoned surface of the Fourth. Why this is the promised land to the people of the Fourth is anyone's guess at this point, but in Final Fantasy VII, the promised land is a place of legend, where the Cetra could commune directly with the planet, and a place of limitless lifestream energy for Shinra to suck up and turn into Mako. Or, in Final Fantasy XIV terms, a land of incredibly dense ether. The final bit of evidence that ties Evercold to Final Fantasy VII is my personal favorite, and it's this image right here. At first glance, this appears to be some sort of industrial forge city with smokestacks and water wheels and foundries. As one examines closer, however, a different picture begins to take shape. Walls divide the outer edges into 8 sections, or plates. Each of these plates is tied to one of these foundries. An immense tower rises from the center like a seat of power. Simply put, I can't look at this and not see Midgar. I've mentioned it a couple times, but Midgar is a city in Final Fantasy VII, and it's perhaps the most iconic location in all of Final Fantasy history. It's a sprawling urban nightmare, a city so large that the entirety of the first part of the remake trilogy is contained exclusively within it. Midgar is notable for its layout. Like a giant pizza, it's divided into 8 slices, otherwise known as plates for those who reside in the city proper, or sectors for the oppressed people who live in the slums beneath it. Much like this concept art shows, each of the plates is connected to a Mako reactor, their source of energy and power. And rising from the center is the immense tower of Shinra HQ. Frankly, for me, the similarities between these two locations are borderline undeniable. The plate structure surrounding the industrial heart is all but a smoking gun. Obviously, if this is our Midgar, it has seemingly eschewed the dystopian diesel punk vibes of Midgar in favor of a more traditional fantasy aesthetic, with rivulets of lava fueling forges. Because of the Norse influence, this city does give me specifically Muspelheim vibes. Muspelheim is a land of fire, inhabited by fire giants. And although they have no direct connection to Muspelheim in Norse mythology, dwarves do play a prominent role as crafters and creators. We've already had dwarves in one of the reflections, so I wouldn't expect them to re-emerge, but maybe these cute little cat weirdos will serve as our dwarven stand-ins and will also be our crafter-allied society. So, When you take everything into consideration, Evercold does begin to look like a very deliberate return to that Goldilocks zone where Creative Studio 3 builds something new on the backbone of something familiar. If this really is the moment where Final Fantasy XIV leans into both Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy XIII at once, then we're not just getting references, we're getting a reinterpretation of two of the most thematically linked entries in the entire series. And if I'm even half right, then Evercold is going to be one of the most layered expansions they've ever done. So now I want to hear from you. What parallels did I miss? What theories are you cooking? And do you think that this really is the Final Fantasy VII and XIII expansion? Or am I completely off the mark? As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, bye bye birdies.